of civil unrest. We will be listening to 2 of them. There are probably a lot more, but today we'll hear from Chief Skinner of the Eugene Police Department, and next week we will hear from the president of the NAACP, Ibrahim Coulibaly. So he will be our speaker next year, or next week. So you'll want to compare and contrast and listen and learn. So with that, I'll give you Kyle, who will unmute himself. There you go.
I'm not sure how much more to say, Chris. You did a fantastic job, but I appreciate the chief being here to talk today. And then it'll be interesting to hear kind of an update about where things are at from the police side. And with that, we'll just let him have it.
Okay. Well, we will cut. If you can leave some time for question and answers and be finished by about 10 minutes until 1, Chief, then we will finish our regular business at that time.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I'm probably going to leave you even more time than that. As I do these things and talk a little bit about what's going on. First of all, let me apologize. My connectivity is not great, and so I have a tendency to leave my video off so that we don't get disconnected. So you may just get audio from me.
Okay.
And I've been having these conversations a lot lately, as you can imagine. And so some of the more robust and meaningful dialogue comes as a result of being able to answer questions. So I'm going to definitely want to leave enough time so people can ask questions and I can answer them, because I'm finding that there's different things on different people's minds when it comes to this particular topic. And I think you did a really nice job of outlining there's a lot of different views around this. And I think what you'll find is there's going to be some similarities between what I tell you today and kind of my thoughts on this and Ibrahim's thoughts next week around some of the civil unrest that we're seeing. And so let me just kind of give you a little bit of a landscape of kind of where we are as a police department, and kind of what we feel like our part is as we continue this important conversation in our community. So as early as last night, we've had protests. We saw the result of the Breonna Taylor grand jury out of Kentucky yesterday, and I thought that the Department of Justice down there did a nice job of trying to outline kind of the fact pattern by which they have to make decisions, and certainly tried to bifurcate the emotions around it and just the sadness around the loss of life down there under those set of circumstances, and separating out the fact pattern by which officers acted. And what we've seen a lot right now is that obviously there's a lot of emotion involved, and it has been building and pent up prior to kind of that threshold event when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And so we've seen a significant amount of protesting and different types of dialogue going on all over the country, and more specifically here in the Northwest, and mostly in Portland and in Eugene. We seem to share kind of a similar set of circumstances with respect to the amount of protests that we see, and just the voices that would like to be heard, exercising their free speech rights. And so we continue to manage that, and we continue to try and create space for people to be heard and to be able to demonstrate and protest, and while also trying to do our very, very best to keep this community safe. And sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it's really difficult. I think we are at about $650,000 worth of overtime costs just to manage protests right now. And so, we are committed to doing that. And so there are a significant amount of financial resources put towards the safety of this community. And we've tried to strike a balance between how do we create space for people to be heard, to be able to gather, be able to march, even acquiescing a bit and allowing for some of our city streets to be blocked for periods of time, and balance that with the other response, which has a tendency to aggravate situations even worse, which is a heavy police response or a heavy-handed police response. We've tried not to do that. We've tried to reserve our interactions in enforcement to situations that are criminal in nature, to the extent that it's a safety issue for our community or a significant property damage issue. And that all started really on the night of May 29th, when things got away from us quite a bit. That protest started kind of very, very suddenly, and through social media, it grew to a number that certainly was larger than we could manage. And then that crowd grew very, very violent. And then that area of 7th and Washington was hardest hit with those businesses. And then our downtown core was hit really, really hard. And so from that time, we responded over the next 3 days, and we were being heavily criticized for the way we responded over the next 3 days. And we certainly weren't perfect. We made some mistakes in that response. And I attribute that to the fact that we're just not very good at this, which that's the good news. If you're a jurisdiction that's really, really good at this, that means you've been living in this space for a long time. We're learning, and we're learning what response is appropriate, and what tools and tactics and strategies are successful and which ones aren't. And so we really learned over those next kind of 72 hours after that Friday night, I believe it was a Friday night on May 29th, how to respond. And since then, I think we've done a nice job of trying to strike that balance that I was talking about earlier, between being present and watchful, but not being an agitator to a group that's already very angry and emotional. And so, we've gone through the summer with protests, something happening almost every single week through the summer, and maybe even multiple days a week, oftentimes. And then we got a little bit of a reprieve when our air quality was so horrible over the last couple of weeks, and then it started back up again last night. What we're seeing is really different groups that are out taking the streets, and they have different names. And there's a Black Lives Matter group, there's a Black Unity group, there's a American Descendants of Slaves group, there's just a variety of groups, and all of which kind of have their own personality, so to speak. And we kind of have grown to better understand what to expect from certain groups, and especially what to expect based on the way they publicize their gatherings. And in some cases, they actually specifically call for civil unrest and disobedience, and in some cases, what they call is like creativity and tactics, which is code for, let's see if we can get away with criminal behavior. And so we know that different groups kind of bring different challenges for us as a police department. And then, of course, the nuance that's added to that is the infusion of counter protesters that show up because they feel like they need to protect the community, or that we're not doing our job. And they show up usually with American flags and open carry guns, firearms here, which is legal in the state. And that has a tendency to aggravate things even worse. So we're really fighting against a couple of different, fighting towards trying to get to a peaceful, through a peaceful moment in time with a couple of different groups that have a tendency to find their own ways to kind of agitate each other. And so we're really kind of caught in the middle of all of that. And we had a protest last night, for instance, and you'll see a press release that goes out that started off fairly peaceful. They took the streets, they blocked the street, they marched, they chanted, they had speeches at the courthouse, and many of them left. And then a small contingent of people stayed behind and got more speeches, and they essentially called for this group to be a little bit more demonstrative in our community. And then here we go. The next thing we know, we've got 40 people marching on campus with spray paint cans, marking up the things that they can. with a variety of things about law enforcement. And I think what we as a police department are struggling with and continuing to be frustrated with is, I do believe in my heart of hearts that there is a way to be able to be heard and exercise your right to free speech and lawful assembly without your finger needing to be on the nozzle of a spray paint can. I just think there's a way to continue the conversation and to get the attention to a very important issue that deserves the attention without throwing a rock through local business windows, without having to spray paint a variety of colorful words on University of Oregon campus and neighboring businesses and vehicles. But unfortunately, we do have a group of individuals that have taken advantage of this moment in time to be able to do whatever they want. And we stay committed to doing the very best we can to identifying who those individuals are and holding them accountable. We made a couple of arrests last night. The outcomes, the investigative outcomes of the May 29th, I'll just call it a riot, because it you know, when you're dragging people's personal property into the middle of the street and setting it on fire, that's exactly what that is. You know, we've made several arrests in that, and we have other arrests pending on that. And so we remain committed to doing what I believe a police department should do, which is recognize that we have victims in this community that need our help, that need us to investigate, and need us to help the system hold people accountable. And so we'll stay committed to that. And so we constantly try to reach out and have dialogue with these groups to try and better understand what to expect and set expectations around behavior. And we'll continue to be open and ready to have those conversations. But we often see many of these groups, their initiatives or their events that they have continue to get hijacked by a smaller group of individuals that are taking advantage of the situation. And interestingly enough, around race equality and civil unrest and social justice, is the majority of these individuals are young white men that are perpetrating these crimes. And it's no different than in Portland and some of the things they've seen up there. And so we stay, like I said, we stay committed to try and keep this community safe and be able to do those things. But it's getting frustrating for your police department, as you can imagine. We're lucky we got a little bit of a reprieve, because your police department was getting very fatigued with the amount of oversight that we needed to exercise on behalf of this community when these protests were going on. So as we move forward, though, there are some things that are happening at the city level that I think could be really, really, really beneficial and can be hopeful for people. One of the things that we're doing is next week, I believe, is the first week that a specific ad hoc committee that the council formed that brings together 2 members of a variety of different groups that are kind of in this space having these conversations, and bringing them together to talk specifically about police policy and procedure as it pertains to what's called Campaign Zero, which is a set of recommendations around police reform that this group believes police should adopt. And so we're not quite sure to what extent we'll be involved in those conversations. My guess is that I've kind of offered Kyle up to being involved in that. Whether you knew this or not, Kyle, as a part of our organization, is deeply engaged in our policy formation and implementation, works closely with our police commission, which already looks at our policies. And so he'll be in that space, working from time to time, helping them better understand who we are and why we do what we do. So I'm anxious and I'm hopeful that this group will look at this Campaign Zero and these different things that should happen in police reform and come to the conclusion that in some cases the Eugene Police Department is actually pretty far along when it comes to these reforms. For instance, your police department's been wearing body cameras for 5 years or more, and Kai would have the specifics on that, but I'm guessing it's 5 years or more, or at least had the first pilot of body cams in 5 years, and we've been in them full time for at least 3 to 4 years. And that's one of the.
Yeah, I
Go
would
ahead,
say,
Kyle.
yeah, I would say that's accurate. Piloting probably as long as 6 years ago, because we had a couple of years, I would say, of piloting different products and seeing it, and then full department rollout was probably 4 years ago, would be my guess.
Yeah, and I'm guessing we're one of the, for the agency size that we are, we were probably the one of the first agencies in the state of Oregon to implement those across such a large organization. And so you have that, which is called for in Campaign Zero. So you get to check that box already with your police department. The other things that I think we can be proud of is the fact that we have probably more civilian oversight and independent oversight with the police auditor, the civilian review board, and the police commission than any agency our size, or perhaps larger in the Northwest, maybe on the West Coast, with those things. And so there's an awful lot of things that are already in place that I think really should leave people hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. The challenging part is that people have known about these things, and this community has known about these things for a long time. We went through our own really tough time when we had 2 officers engaged in criminal behavior, back in the mid 2000s, which really is what prompted kind of moving this direction. And this community has grown into those shoes, so to speak, of what civilian and independent oversight feels like. I think the frustrating piece is after May 29th, it feels like everybody's got a sudden case of amnesia, that they don't remember how far this police department has actually come. Oh, look at that. That's the best part of my day right there.
Someone just woke up from his nap, so he thought he'd come by and say hi.
I'm glad he got his mother's looks. That's all I'm going to say.
Me both.
So I think people, it's nice as people kind of settle a little bit and recognize that their police department has come a long way in the last 10 to 15 years, and actually is really positioned well to take on some of these asks around police reform. And so I'll be anxious to see what the ad hoc committee talks about. I think with the community safety initiative coming up, the payroll tax, even though it's a really tough financial discussion right now for many people to include city government, I think it does pose a perfect opportunity to kind of reshape what public safety looks like in this community. And so I'm hopeful about that. And really what we're focused on as a police department is how do we get police officers back to doing what police officers should be doing? Your police officers, your men and women that serve in this community are really gifted at a lot of things, and are mandated to be trained in a lot more things than they're gifted at doing, because we've been asked over the decades in this profession to continue to absorb more and more of society's problems. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to get calls, hey, I'm struggling with my out of control teenager. Can you come help parent my kid? We're responding to behavioral health issues. We're responding to mental health issues. We're responding to substance abuse issues. There's just a lot of things that police departments across this country are being asked to do. And so for me, it's the key is how do we get our law enforcement professionals back doing what we feel like they should really be doing? And how do we create a resource for the other needs? How do we get back to matching a response and the resource and the correct resource responding to the needs that we have in our community? And so we're really going to be working hard on what that looks like. And a great example of that is right now, we're piloting in the infant stages of developing and trying to work out the bugs of of a program that saw our parking enforcement officers basically out of work because, you know, the parking revenue for the city of Eugene is down like 95%, 97%, just because of the pandemic. So you have these parking officers who are used to doing that kind of outreach work and that enforcement work and that, you know, having tough conversations with people that are parking illegally or meters are expired out of work. Well, what we've done is we've reimagined that and reassigned them to doing more outreach work around some of the car camping and getting ready with some of the right-of-way camping where they can be the first touch when we have campers in the right-of-way or people staying, living in their cars where they shouldn't be, instead of sending a police department. And that's the type of thing that we should do. Now, ultimately, we may have to get engaged if somebody is refusing to move or becomes violent or destructive. But at the beginning of that contact, it doesn't necessarily always warrant a uniform and a badge showing up, which has a tendency to just escalate things and aggravate things worse sometimes for especially for those folks that are in crisis or experiencing homelessness or suffering from mental illness or substance addiction or both. And so we're thinking about what the right response is for the need and how we build those things. And I think we'll see some creative solutions over this next year come out of discussions with the ad hoc committee, community safety initiative, and how we maybe readjust and reinvest those dollars to meet needs. And then, just having a police department that is super progressive and is super open to what the next evolution of policing looks like as we try to keep this community safe. So with that, I'm going to stop there because I have a tendency to lose track of time. And I want to just leave a little bit of space for questions so that you guys can kind of finish up your business before that 1 o'clock hour.
I see we have a question in the chat box, Chris, from Anita. Wondering if police department is making any special arrangements for the night of the national election.
Yeah, I just remembered what happened 4 years ago, the march from the U of O to, I think, the federal building or something. So who knows what's going to happen that night? Are you making,
Yeah, 100%. I can't tell you how often we have this conversation. Every week we're talking about what November 3rd could look like, and really it's going to be an interesting. Well, depending on what happens, I think we're going to have some level of issues we're going to have to deal with regardless of the outcome. I do believe we will see people taking the streets regardless of the outcome. The nuance to this one will be interesting is I don't think we'll know the outcome of the election for several days after November 3rd because of the number of mail-in ballots that will need to be counted. And so there'll be some early returns that will get certain people really, really either excited or worked up. And then I think we'll be living in that space for several days after that election. But we're talking about that. We're talking about what it takes, and I gotta tell you, it's a tough conversation because, like I said, I'm already $650,000 down, and that's $650,000 that I can't do other things with that really benefit this community because I have to pay for coverage, and so that becomes frustrating. But we're thinking about November, early November. We're thinking about really how long those could last depending on the outcome. I think there's a couple of different scenarios there that things maybe last longer than others depending on who wins that election. But yes, we're ready. I wouldn't say we're ready to go, but we are engaged in having that kind of conversation.
Thank you. We have another question from Walt. If you want to put questions in chat boxes, this works pretty good. But Walt asks, have the arrests that have been made been successful in getting the individuals away from the protests?
Yeah, what we try to do is as we watch protests, and Kyle does a nice job. Kyle's got one of the greatest jobs in the police department. So through all these protests, Kyle's sitting usually in a lazy boy chair with a controller flying the drones. So don't feel sorry for Kyle. he's got a good gig, but he does a nice job of keeping track of what's going on, and that's valuable intelligence for us. And what we try to do is we try to surgically remove agitators from the crowd instead of just going in and just assuming that they're all engaged. We've gotten better at kind of identifying the key players that need to be removed from the crowd. And interestingly enough, we after the May 29th, the really bad night we had, it took us a few months to really identify who the players were and build a probable cause case for felony arrests. And then we made our first series of like 20 arrests midsummer, and really after that, I thought it felt like, especially in social media, that we kind of turned a corner where people are like, wow, Eugene PD really, they said they were going to investigate this, and they actually did, and they actually made arrests. And so it really put some of the more violent protesters on their heels, thinking, okay, maybe there are some consequences to my action. And so we started to see a little bit of a different posture from them. They didn't feel quite as free and open and mobile as we had seen prior to that. And so that's why it's important for me to continue to have this police department stay focused on what our mission is, which is keeping us all safe and doing really good investigations and making those arrests where appropriate. And that's kind of what our approach is going to be as we move through the rest of this fall and into election season.
Okay, thank you. Leslie Parker has a question. She wants to know, from your perspective, the police department perspective, does Eugene have enough resources like cahoots and local hospitals to provide mental health support?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And the answer just really simply is no. But we don't have those resources anywhere. Think of it this way. We deal with somebody that's in crisis out on the street. For whatever reason, we arrive and we have that encounter. It's not lost on me to think about how many systems failed that person before we actually got them. Your law enforcement people are kind of like the grease trap in a restaurant. It just catches everything that something else doesn't catch. It just seems like that, we're just a catch basin for all these things that have slipped through the cracks. And we have so many systems that have been defunded or underfunded over the course of the years that we just don't have enough. We don't have enough sobering services. We don't have enough emergency shelter for people. We don't have enough mental health wraparound services, addiction services. I could just go on and on and on. And so part of the defunding of police is predicated on, well, let's take all the money from police and let's put it into those services. And I don't think any of us would refute that those services are important to fund. But the defunding of your police department should only come after you feel like you've adequately funded your police department to handle the issues that they're trying to handle. There's still 80, on average, 80 calls a day that we get from people in this community that would like police response or need police response that we can't get to. We can put us in that category of underfunded or a lack, or not keeping up with the demand is probably a better way to put it over the decades. We still have victims in this community, victims of theft, victims of assault, victims of a variety of different crimes that we just can't get to. And that hurts my heart when I think about what I signed on to this job to do as a police officer 30 years ago, and now what I'm assigned on to do as a leader that's to serve victims and to advocate on behalf of victims that have been impacted by crime. And when you can't do that, it's really, really hard. And so, we think about funding. Yes, we need more funding in a lot of different areas, but let's not lose sight of the fact that in my mind, that can only happen when you've provided adequate funding to make sure people just fundamentally feel safe, that they and feel like when they call 911, they can actually get a response.
Okay, thank you. Lonnie, your question, I think, unmute yourself and ask, is this a question for Chris?
Yeah. Exactly.
Go ahead and ask him.
My question is, what does the term Black Lives Matter to you?
What does it mean to me, Lonnie? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that, I've thought about that, and it's interesting because, we have this conversation in my house. I've got a 13-year-old and 11-year-old, and they're right in the middle of all this, trying to understand what this means for them. For me, it's important for me to recognize that I'm part of a profession that from time to time, and in different parts of the country from time to time have disproportionately utilized their authority and their power against African Americans, Latinos. We've just seen that happen before. I mean, when you think about Ferguson and the unrest that happened in Ferguson, part of why Ferguson was ended up being such a difficult situation after that particular killing was the fact that community had been suffering and struggling with race relations for years. That was just the culmination of lots of really, really tough behavior from that police department in its communities of color and its minority community. But for me, when I think about Black Lives Matter, I try to expand my scope beyond policing and what that means to me as a police chief, and think about, and as I've learned and as I've been open to learning more, just some of the disparity that we see, not only, obviously in policing, but in housing and in healthcare and in a variety of other arenas that have not been as equitable and inclusive as they can be. And so I try to keep it high level when I think about Black Lives Matter. I really don't let the BLM movement, for me, speak specifically to police. And it's hard to do that. And it's easy to do that here. And for some, it's harder than others, but because we don't live in a terribly diverse community right now.
Right.
Eugene is about 85 to 87% white. What we have is a real strength of diversity and thought and opinion here. And we see that, in some of the protests that are going on. So, for me, it's about recognition that there has been some injustices there, and, and a commitment to say my part of Black Lives Matter as a white police chief and in a position of power is that I have the ability to listen, and I have the ability to affect change where it makes sense. And so that's kind of what I stay committed to.
Thank you very much, Chief. That was just a great presentation, and really appreciate your thoughts and your sense of balance through a tough time. Because the Rotary International is dedicated to eradicating polio, we would like to donate 10 polio vaccinations in your name as a way of thanking you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today. And let's give the chief some applause. Even if it's quiet, we're all for you, Chief.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy Rotary, my talks with Rotary. I'm always happy to be available to come on and kind of give you an update. I know that you guys are so focused on service, and so focused on kind of the relationships you have in the community. It's important for you to, and I really applaud you for having Ibrahim on next week, because you're going to hear a completely different perspective from a Black man that feels really, really strongly about some things. And like I said, he and I have worked together since I've been here, and there's some things that we are completely in alignment on, and some things that maybe aren't, but that's just because we haven't had the same types of experiences. So
Exactly.
hopefully that'll be really, really valuable for you.